we talk about the history or the development of monster films in America, it's very different. It owes a lot to what was going on in Europe, but it took place at a different pace. And I think because of that, in a different, unique way in the Hollywood system, which is one of the reasons why I dearly love the classic monster movies so much. We'll talk about that in a second. Let me just get this here before I continue. Nathaniel's Lozball says, I like monster movies because the monster can be anything, but it follows a structure. What is the monster? What can it do? Why is it dangerous? And how do the heroes beat it or escape its wrath? Yeah, I mean, you can have elemental monsters like Dracula, and you can have sympathetic monsters like Frankenstein. Just thinking about like the Hollywood Universal classic horrors. You know, some monsters had a lot of pathos, like Wolfman or Frankenstein. Some of them were just straight up evil, like the Invisible Man or Dracula. Um, yeah, you can tell so many great stories. I mean, monsters. We've told monster stories as humanity ever since the dawn of time, right? Whether you're talking about the spirit in the woods or whatever, or a proper monster or whatever. So it's really interesting. So you had things like the Grand Guignol, theater wise. Now we talked about Dracula that was published at the end of the 1800s as well. Film at that point was starting to come about when films first started to happen. Silent films were more of a sort of spectacle. See what we can achieve with film. Look at this, sort of magic trick kind of visual thing that we can. It looks like that person disappeared. It looks like that. That was the kind of little short spectacles that films were. And then eventually it got to be where let's tell at least little short narratives with films. And 10 minutes, 20 minutes, at first certainly got to be up to, hour and a half movies, silent films. In Europe, we can't talk about classic American monster movies without talking about German Expressionism. There was a really weird time in Germany between World War I and World War II. We had the Weimar Republic in power, and it was a very liberated time. Think about like the 20s in America, where sort of anything goes. That was what was happening between World War I and World War II in Germany. Now, slowly, the Nazi Party came to power, and Hitler came to power. But part of it was a visceral reaction to all of the just flagrant disregarding of morals that was going on. But you did have, in the plus side, you had a lot of great advances in art, some art anyway. And in film, we had these wonderful movies that were being made, really trying to explore what was possible with the medium of film. This is, of course, when Murnau made Nosferatu. Bram Stoker's wife was still alive at the time, Florence Stoker, and she sued them famously because they didn't ask her for the rights. They changed the names, but it was still very much the Dracula story. She won the lawsuit. They were ordered to destroy all prints of Nosferatu. Thankfully, some survived because it's a amazingly well done film. It's very well done, in terms of it's worth studying. But the things they did with the light and shadow, the things they did with not really worrying about a realistic take. This is film, and film started out, playing all these sort of visual tricks and everything. So why need to show a completely realistic story on a visual film? Why not go fantastic? And you had a lot of pioneers working to make it sort of this expressionistic take. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the classic that people point to. And of course, the Gollum, the image I had on the right side of my screen was Der Gollum, how he came into the world. I'll talk about that in a second. Tim Burton, I'm going to see Beetlejuice tomorrow. Tim Burton is heavily influenced by the German Expressionism, the extended doorways, the askew, dressers, the buildings which are slanted, the roads which are crooked, that kind of thing is from German Expressionism. And you see that with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. You start to see a little bit of it in the Gollum movies. Paul Wegener made a movie, The Student of Prague, which some people think is the first horror film. And then he made these Gollum movies. He made the first Gollum movie And the idea of the Golem is a Jewish folkloric character. This creature sort of from comes from Jewish mysticism. A creature formed of clay that these special kabbalistic prayers can be said over, and the creature comes alive to protect the Jewish people at different times in their history when they're persecuted. That's the folkloric idea of the Golem. So Paul Wegener made this character in this film, The Golem. It's lost. The silent film he made is completely lost to us now. He made a second film to kind of keep, because he wanted to do a big historical drama, like a period piece, and he didn't quite have the money at first. So the first movie he did was sort of an art dealer, I think, finding the Golem in a basement warehouse or whatever in the 20s there. Then the second movie he did was a really interesting sort of meta film. It's called The Golem and the Dancing Girl. And it was an interesting film. You think about movies we have today, like Scream, which references horror movies, and the tropes of horror movies are Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which was what if Freddy was coming out of the movies and they had to go make another movie to contain Freddy. That was an interesting take. But this silent film in the 20s by Paul Wegener he was the guy who did The Golem. So he said, let me make a movie about this woman, this dancer, who goes to see the movie that I made. So the movie Golem and the Dancing Girl is the second film in this Golem trilogy. It too has been lost to us tragically. A lot of these early films, just they weren't cared for. They were done in certain films that didn't last. They were lost, and there's a lot of lost classics, sadly. But he made this movie, and the premise is this dancer girl, this girl goes to see his movie, The Golem, and she's just fascinated by the character of the Golem. She's just fascinated by that character to the point where she's almost in love with this creature, the Golem, this big clay creature. Now, Paul Wegener, the director, he plays in the movie as the director of the Golem, and he tries to hit on her, basically. She turns down his advances. So he thinks, fine. So he has a gift, a life-size statue of the Golem shipped to her, and it's actually him in costume. And then he slowly comes to life, and she's elated because she can, be in love with this Golem figure. It was a weird, trippy movie. It's not, existent today, sadly, but it's a very meta, type film. And then he finally, because of all that, he finally had the money to do the Golem, How He Came Into the World, which is the prequel. It's also the first horror prequel. So it's like the first horror trilogy. The last one's the first horror prequel, which did finally go back in time into the medieval times there in Germany and tell the story of the original Jewish mystic who, brought this Golem to life and so forth. It's a classic film, and that film is still existent. Is in existence. You can still go watch that. With a lot of these silent films, they are in public domain, which means you're going to get a lot of crappy prints and stuff like that. Even though I'm usually not so gung-ho about, you got to get the Blu-ray or the 4K. When it comes to a lot of those silent films, your best bet is getting a Blu-ray or 4K, or, at least a Blu-ray, because you've got somebody who's cleaned up, the print of it, because otherwise you can get a lot of prints that aren't, done very well and are kind of hard to watch. But, so Nosferatu, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Golem, Metropolis, certainly. A lot of films that were made at that time were heavily influenced the filmmakers in Hollywood who came about in the 30s. And some of the filmmakers in Germany even fled Germany once the Nazis came to power, like Karl Freund, who came over. He was the cinematographer on Dracula. He was the director of The Mummy, for Universal. He was from, Germany. He was working with the Impressionists. And you see a lot of that, or expressionists, excuse me, and you see a lot of German expressionism in the early American monster films. The idea of, the castles, twisted and high vaulted ceilings and all this kind of stuff. So you see a lot of that influence there as well. What's interesting about horror films in America, all of the silent films we had that could be considered horror were never truly supernatural. Remember when I was talking about Gothic novels and the different tropes of Gothic novels and how that influence has stayed with us even to today? There is a, was it called Gothic? There was a movie I've missed, but people have been telling me I really need to see it, that had Tom Hiddleston and what's her name? Was it Ron Howard's daughter was in it too? Or Crimson, I forget what it was called, but it came out just a few years ago. People were saying that's really good, but it's a Gothic movie. in the 2000s. That movie Skeleton Key, I think with Kate Hudson, was she in it? Came out. Another Gothic movie, Gothic American South movie, was these really great movies. So the Gothic is still with us in film, in Hollywood film, and they were heavily early Hollywood movies. Silent films were heavily influenced by Gothic. You would have a lot of movies like The Cat and the Canary, which seemed to be supernatural. Things were going on, but then in the end, it was all explained. So it was kind of like the Anne Radcliffe Gothic novels, where whatever seemingly supernatural thing was going on, you ended up being this one person who was trying to frighten these other people out of their money or something like that. So you had a lot of movies like that. We did have the great Lon Chaney, and I'm talking about Lon Chaney Sr., who played in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, who did of course, The Phantom of the Opera, I think is probably his best film. He was really great at doing the stage makeup. If you haven't watched, if you're not a silent film fan, and you're not really great, crazy about watching a lot of them, you at least have to watch Phantom of the Opera. Such a wonderful film. If you're a monster movie fan, if you're a horror film fan, because Lon Chaney's it was just brilliant in that movie. But again, Phantom of the Opera isn't a supernatural character. It's an actual person, posing as the Phantom in that theater, demented as he is, deformed and demented and so forth. Lon Chaney also did a movie with Todd Browning, who would go on to direct Dracula, called London After Midnight. And this was also a silent film. Todd Browning was wanting to do a vampire movie, perhaps wanting to even do a Dracula movie. And he wanted to work with Lon Chaney, so they did this movie called London After Midnight. Again, the idea is that Hollywood thought America wasn't quite ready for a movie that really had a supernatural element to it. So if it looked such supernatural, it was always explained in the end. And London After Midnight, Todd Browning would go on to remake it later in his career with Bela Lugosi. It was called what's it called? Shadow of the Vampire? I'm blanking on the name of it, but he remade it as a talkie with Bela Lugosi later. It's a good film. But he did it first with Lon Chaney, who's this detective who poses as this vampire character. And Lon Chaney was set to star in Dracula when they were going to do it. So it was, they just didn't think America was ready for real, true supernatural content. When they got the idea to do it, it was because, things were changing. We had the Depression coming about, happening in the 30s. Americans desperately needed escapism. You also had their life. Many Americans' life was riddled with such horrors in their everyday life that if we're going to see bad guys or horrors on the screen, let's contextualize them in a clear monster. Let me give all the horrors in my life a clear monster face. Go ahead and make it a real supernatural monster. That's an easier recontextualization as well, So if you're going for escapism, but you're also going to see the vicissitudes of your life worked out on screen in a story, yeah, make it a real monster. That's what great, good monster films are for. So Dracula was the first American Hollywood film that actually had a true blue supernatural creature in it, which was, of course, Bela Lugosi's brilliant portrayal of Dracula.